Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for Global Engagement's Faith and International Affairs Conference Call Series. My name is Dennis Hoover, editor of the Review of Faith and International Affairs, and I'll serve as the moderator on today's call. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Thomas Farr, president of the Religious Freedom Institute and director of the Religious Freedom Project at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Dr. Farr was founding director of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom from 1999 to 2003. He's also a prolific author whose works include the influential 2008 book, World of Faith and Freedom, Why International Religious Freedom is Vital to American National Security, from Oxford University Press. He is a longtime contributing editor at the Review of Faith and International Affairs, and I'm also very happy to be working with Tom currently as his co-author on a forthcoming policy brief on U.S. international religious freedom policy. Dr. Farr's topic for our call today is particularly timely, namely what President Trump should and shouldn't do about international religious freedom. Before I turn the mic over to Tom, a few quick words on the call format and protocol. We'll begin with about 20 minutes of remarks from Tom, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please press 5* at any point during the call, and you'll be placed in the queue. Please also note that this call is on the record, and an audio recording will be made available on the IG website. So with that introduction, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, Tom. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks to you and to IGE for doing this important call, and I hope to at least provide the basis for a good discussion of some very important issues that are facing our country, particularly with respect to international religious freedom policy and our foreign policy around the world. If I might, just a mild amendment to the topic, not only what the President will do, but what his administration will do, should and should not do with respect to international religious freedom. That way we can include, the Secretary of State, the State Department, and so forth as his administration, but of course speaking to what the President's priorities are in all of this. What I'd like to do is discuss 6 items, prescriptions, if you will. 5 of them are what I think the Trump administration should do. 1 they should not do. And what I will do is just tick through them very briefly at the beginning and then go back and fill them in a bit so that we can have a basis for discussion. The first of, and in some ways the most important that will precede the others, is that, in my view, the President himself should state clearly not only that religious freedom is important to the United States, but that it's important to the world, and that, as a consequence, U.S. international religious freedom policy for everyone, religious freedom for everyone, will be consolidated and expanded under the Trump administration. My second prescription is that the President should nominate quickly an ambassador at large with the personal credentials for success and give that ambassador the authority and the resources necessary to succeed. Third, I would urge the administration to begin to connect international religious freedom with international stability and therefore with U.S. national security. Fourth, I would urge the administration to look at international religious freedom as an all-of-government human rights and national security strategy for the United States, that is to say, not simply the State Department, but all of the executive and indeed the legislative branch as well. Fifth, within the Department of State, train and incentivize diplomats and others in our foreign policy establishment actually to advance religious freedom in our foreign policy. And then finally, the 6th of my points, the one thou shalt not, if you will, thou shalt not permit yourself, in my view, you should not permit yourself, to contribute to the decline of religious freedom in the United States by excluding Muslims and other non-Christian minorities from the administration's approach to international religious freedom, including in the controversial temporary refugee ban, which I will speak about at the very end. As I will say at the time, I think that there are ways to talk about this that are a bit overblown, but I think there are some very, very important issues embedded in this refugee and ban on admission to the United States, temporary ban of foreigners from these 7 countries. So let me go back now and give a few details about these 6 items. First, just a brief background for those who may not be familiar with the institutional groups that I'll be referring to here. But in 1998, Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, which mandates the advancement of religious freedom in our foreign policy, and established an office in the State Department, the Office of International Religious Freedom, and at its head the ambassador at large, who is a very senior diplomatic official, to be the executive agent, if you will, of that policy, to lead it, to ensure that the United States is effective and successful. So that's 1998. We've had going on 19 years of this policy, 3 administrations, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, 2 political parties, 4 ambassadors. So the point is, we've got a lot of water under the bridge. We have a lot of empirical evidence of what we have and have not done with respect to this policy, so that anyone who wants to opine about what the Trump administration should or should not do need not just start from nothing. They have a great deal of evidence. And one of the themes of my remarks will be, or one of the premises of my remarks will be, that while we have had in every administration and each of these offices and ambassadors very good people, in some cases heroic people who have worked very hard, by and large, our international religious freedom policy has been ineffective, in my view, because if you simply look at the way the world is going and the trends over the last decade at least, religious freedom is in global decline, and religious persecution, religion-related violence, religion-related terrorism is on the rise and is spreading. So while the United States is certainly not responsible for that, or certainly not all of it, nevertheless, I think it is fair to say that we have not had the impact that almost anyone would have had, would have wanted with respect to our foreign policy, our diplomacy in international religious freedom. So against that background, let me go to my 6 items and say first that, in my view, the President should state clearly to the American public, I might say some of this is taken from the recommendations, the policy brief that Dennis mentioned that he and I are working on. The President should state clearly, and his audience here is not only the American public and the Congress, but the U.S. foreign policy establishment, foreign governments, the victims of religious persecution, and non-state religious terrorist movements. So there's a big audience. What he should make clear, I believe, in a public address is that religious freedom is a universal right and an essential component of social stability and well-being, that it's vital to U.S. interests in the world, religious freedom is, including our quest for international justice and peace and stability, as well as the defense of American national security. I'll come back to that in a minute. And that, as a consequence of this, U.S. IRF policy will be consolidated and expanded under his administration and will be integrated into U.S. policies that are designed to reduce not only religious persecution, but counter violent religious extremism and conflict, stabilize post-conflict societies and struggling democracies, and promote economic growth. I think this is a very important but emphasized subject, that religious freedom is connected to economic growth, and, of course, to pursue justice. These are all a very big basket of things that religious freedom could contribute to in our foreign policy if we were more successful in advancing it, and to date have not been terribly successful. I believe that the National Security Advisor should name a senior NSC advisor on international religious freedom policy, and that the administration should assign the new ambassador at large, which which I'm going to talk about in a second, as a special assistant to the president on national security. These are ways that I believe the Trump administration from the very top, from the White House, can begin to say we are serious, and perhaps more serious than prior administrations, Republican or Democrat, have been with respect to international religious freedom policy. Second, nominate quickly, and I want to emphasize that adverb, I guess it is, quickly, hopefully within the first wave of nominations beyond the cabinet, an ambassador at large with the personal credentials for success, and give that ambassador the authority and resources they need. I think these two go hand in hand. I mean, you could nominate a very, very able ambassador, as I believe we've had in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, Ambassador David Saperstein, who I assume most of our listeners know is no longer ambassador. He has left. He was a very able ambassador, but in my opinion, and I should say David might disagree with me on this, we've talked about it many times, the administration did not provide, the State Department did not provide the resources and the authority he needed to do more than he did, even though he was in some sense successful. So what do I mean first by the personal credentials? I'll tick through them. A commitment to and understanding religious freedom as a fundamental human right for all human beings and all religious communities. And it is not simply a private right. Religious freedom means more than the right to worship. It means the right to manifest, in the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one's religious beliefs in public. There's a lot there, but I think it's very important to set that out. So this ambassador should have a very deep and broad understanding of the meaning, a vigorous understanding of the meaning of religious freedom. Second, he should or she should possess foreign policy experience. Now, there's a lot of ways to gain foreign policy experience. It doesn't mean necessarily formally having been a diplomat, but it does mean more than having visited Paris and taken an international relations course at Georgetown or anywhere else. It means having some foreign policy experience. Third, a capacity to operate and lead in a difficult bureaucratic environment and in sometimes a hostile bureaucratic environment such as we have at Foggy Bottom, the Department of State. I don't think it's possible to overestimate this. We have examples among ambassadors who have not had the capacity to survive, let alone lead in the State Department. It's a tough environment. Much of it is simply due to its tradition, its size, and so forth, but some of it is hostility to religion still, even though Ambassador Saperstein and Knox Thames, the special advisor under David Saperstein, have really had an impact, a positive impact on resistance to religion within the State Department. There's still a lot of work to be done. And I should mention now to those who don't know that there is a bit of good news here that Knox Thames I'm told, very close to being approved as remaining on through the end of October as his original Schedule B contract stipulated. I consider this extraordinarily good news. I thought it was very bad that the Obama administration let David Saperstein go until they had their own person as ambassador nominated and in place. We have seen in the past how the Office of Religious Freedom suffers when there's no leader there. And I think Knox remaining there will have a positive impact on that. And by suffering, I mean simply its positions being stolen by other offices in the State Department, morale going down in the office, and foreign governments and the victims of religious persecution noticing this, that while there is an ambassador for this and an ambassador for that, there's no ambassador for America's first freedom. I think this is an important step forward that Knox is still going to be there. My fourth qualification for an ambassador at large is a capacity to develop within the administration a strategy, not just within the State Department, but government-wide within the administration. And one final point on this. This nomination should not be thought of as, and I want to be clear here, as sort of a faith outreach position. I think, having heard a number of people talk about this, my fear is that what they are looking for, or some people think is appropriate for this position, is a clergyman or a woman or a a preacher or a priest or an imam. Well, Rabbi Saperstein has proven that you can be a clergyman and be an excellent ambassador, but you also have to have these other qualifications. So if you're going to choose somebody from the clergy, fine, but just make sure they know how to do foreign policy. This is a foreign policy appointment. It is not a faith outreach appointment. All right, I'll try to go a little more quickly with these others so we don't lose time. The third prescription is to connect religious freedom with international stability and national security. Those of you who read The Hill may have seen today an excellent piece out which argues that religious freedom is a counterterrorism weapon. We can talk about why that's true, but I think some of it is self-evident, that where religious freedom exists, you're far less likely to have violent extremism, religious persecution, religion-related terrorism, simply because all religions are equal in a country with religious freedom, because no one is raised with the proposition that they may be free to believe, as they should be, that their religion is true and that others are false, but they also are exposed enough to other religions to realize that violence against them is counterproductive for their own religious beliefs as well as the society in which they live. So religious freedom can be, if we have the wit to do it, a national security policy for the United States and a counterterrorism policy. Fourth, I would look at international religious freedom as an all-of-government human right and national security strategy. I think it's very important that if we can get this far with our strategic thinking about international religious freedom as a national security strategy, and let me emphasize that, in my view, we are a long way from getting there. But when and if we do, it's very important that this is not seen as simply the purview of a single office in the State Department headed by a single individual. I do believe that this office needs to be expanded and that all of the religion-related functions in the State Department should come under the Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom. But even so, even if that is accomplished, I believe that it is very important that there be interagency coordination. I believe that coordination should be led by the Ambassador at Large, but it could be done in other ways from the National Security Council by, for example, the aforementioned proposed National Security Advisor on religious freedom. However it's done, it needs to involve the Department of Defense. It needs to involve the Department of Commerce, USAID, of course, which is now part of the Department of State. It should involve the Department of the Treasury, the CIA, the Homeland Security, anyone who has an interest in the group of international religious freedom policies that would go into this, should we decide to deepen and expand it, should be part of this, should be part of the interagency policy and strategy that comes out of it. And when Dennis and I produce our policy brief, we will have some very specific recommendations, for example, an interagency study leading to a national security directive in which this would become an official part of American foreign policy. Today, our foreign policy with respect to religious freedom is highly reactive. It is based on the issuance of reports, which are fine reports, but they are not policies. They identify the problem. They do not solve the problem. And I'll just give one example. I mentioned economic growth. Imagine if we could convince, for example, almost any government of the world, but just take the Chinese government, that if they began to back away from the crackdowns that we periodically see in China, they would help themselves in terms of something they desire earnestly, and that is sustained economic growth. There's plenty of evidence to support that argument. We don't make it. We don't even think about it. But I think this all-of-government approach will help us do that. Fifth, within the Department of State, train and incentivize American diplomats, and particularly on the training, I think it would be broader than this. One of our recommendations is going to be in this policy brief that the Department of State, in fact, go ahead and do what it is now required by law to do. Some of you will know that in December of last year, the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Obama. It was an amendment to the 1998 IRFA, and in it, among other things, it actually mandates the training of American diplomats and says, here's how you do it. You train them not only by having seminars about constitutionality and the kinds of things that we've been doing already, but that it is mandatory. That's the key word. So far it's been ad hoc, and it hasn't been training. It's been more like a college seminar. You're going to train somebody how to do something. You have to tell them why it's important and how to do it. And for American diplomats, this is very important. But Congress did not provide funding to do that. You ever heard that problem before? So we're going to continue to work with the appropriations people so that the State Department and its Foreign Service Institute can genuinely provide the kind of training we need. Finally, the sixth item, the do not to the Trump administration. Don't permit yourself to contribute to the decline of religious freedom in the United States by excluding Muslims from the administration's approach to religious freedom. Now, there's a lot there, and you will have noted that I am asserting that there is a decline of religious freedom in the United States. That's a topic in its own right. I think it is not unrelated to our international religious freedom policy. If you don't believe in religious freedom, you're going to find it hard to sell it to others, to convince them that it's in their interest to have. And I think that's a problem we have in our State Department. Indeed, we have in many parts of American culture. But for the Republican Party and a Republican administration to do anything that allows it to be perceived as favoring one particular group over another, and particularly to be perceived as not including Muslims in its international religious freedom policy, let alone its domestic religious freedom policy, I think would be near fatal. Now, let me just add a final word on this subject. I do not believe that the current subject of so much debate in the United States is an anti-Muslim ban. I think that the criticism of this has been somewhat harsh and overstated, if not disingenuous. However, perceptions not on the part of Americans so much, certainly non-Muslim Americans, but I believe on the part of Muslims, American and abroad, is very, very important. And if we're going to be effective in promoting religious freedom in places like Iraq or Pakistan, let alone Saudi Arabia or Iran, we must be perceived as promoting religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. And it is important, I think, and I will zero in on the one part of the executive order that is under discussion, and that is the temporary ban on refugees, in which it speaks of religious minorities in a way that others have interpreted, I think somewhat unjustifiably, as meaning only Christians. Let me point out, and I think the Trump administration should make this explicit if it hasn't already, religious minorities include Muslims abroad. In Sunni majority countries, it certainly includes Shiites, and the reverse is true. But it also includes, in my view, and the Trump administration should say this, disfavored Muslims within the majority community. Sunnis who resist ISIS are, as far as I'm concerned, religious minorities that should be subject to the kinds of exemptions that are granted under this executive order. We have to stand in our country for religious freedom for everybody, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because if we don't do that, this will simply not work. So let me stop there, Dennis, and invite questions and comments.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much, Tom. I'm sure our callers are eager to engage you on these issues further, so we'll now open the lines for questions. As a reminder to audience members, if you'd like to ask a question, press 5 star. And once your turn to ask your question, today's call administrator, Megan Conner, will announce your name and unmute your line so that you can ask it. your line will be placed back on mute immediately after the asking of the question. Please also note that if you are already in the queue and for any reason decide that you no longer wish to ask your question, you can simply press 5* again and your name will be removed from the queue. Finally, for the sake of all our callers, I'll ask that when you're called upon, please immediately ask your question rather than providing your own commentary. So with that, Megan, our first question, please.
Yes, thanks, Dennis, and thank you, Tom. Our first question comes from Manek with Fazana. And to unmute your line, please go ahead with your question.
Yes. I would like to, I represent the Fazana, means Federation of Zoroastrian Associations of North America, and I would like to ask the question whether what we are proposing, we have a online petition to create a United Nations religious arms of the United Nations. And, we have a website, www.unreligiousarm.org. Would that be something that would go along with your idea of, kind of internationalizing this issue of religious freedom?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. Manette, I believe it was.
Yes.
It's a great question. I'm going to sound like an American diplomat here, which I'm trained as. The answer is yes and no. The yes is, I think it's terribly important for every organization that operates in the international sphere to get behind this. And, of course, you will know and many will know that the United Nations has for years had its special rapporteur on religious freedom. I've met the brand new special rapporteur, whose name unfortunately is escaping me. Maybe somebody will call it out in our discussion. But I have a very, very good impression of him. Unfortunately, that position is basically a voluntary position. It has very little oomph behind it. It has virtually no power except to go around and interview and do reports, which of course is not nothing. This reflects the other side, really, Manette, of my concern about this. I fear that the United Nations has in some countries, it has a lack of authoritativeness, if I might put it that way, on this issue. It's all over the map in the way that it defines religious freedom. It, of course, like all of us, stands against religious persecution. But one of the things that I didn't really bring out in my remarks, I think is very important, is that simply being against religious persecution is not enough. I mean, that's simply an assertion. It's rhetoric. And most of the U.S. reports on religious freedom are quite wonderful in describing, not all of them, but some of them are quite good in describing the horrible things that are going on. But what they don't prescribe, and I fear what happens, and one of the weaknesses of the United Nations, is its incapacity really to do anything other than exhort and talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 18 of the ICCPR. All of these things are wonderful. Please don't misunderstand me. They are international standards to which people need to be summoned. But they have been out there for decades. It has not worked. We have to, in my view, take, and I'll sound like an American exceptionalist here, and in some ways I am. I really believe that the United States still has the opportunity. It may have diminishing authority. It may have diminishing credibility. I think it can be regained if this is done right, actually to advance religious freedom in a way that is in the interests of others. So I want to encourage you, Manette, on your work. I think it's very important. I don't want to say anything at all or be perceived as disparaging it. It's important. But I don't want to see that as a surrogate or a replacement for what the United States, which is arguably the most powerful nation and potentially the most influential in the world, ought to be doing, but is failing to do for others, not just for itself, to stop the religious persecution and advance religious freedom.
Thank you. I agree with you that it should not be a replacement, but it could be considered as something that will strengthen the U.S. effort.
I agree.
Right.
I agree.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from Soraya Dean with the Muslim Women Speakers. Soraya, I'm going to unmute your line and go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Thank you so much for your vision and your words, and of course the action that needs to be taken. After a long time, I felt safe. Thank you. So as a Muslim woman, my work is centered around focusing on deconstructing some of our received theology. And every time I address this issue, the Muslim community in America is grappling with an even more serious issue. It's going back and forth, and I just want to ask you, we need to do two things. First is that we need to really reach out to Mr. Trump, because I feel that the community is so divided and we are building walls ourselves. How can we do that? And secondly, how can we, do you see the need for the extreme ideology in some parts of the world that needs to be addressed also as strongly as religious freedom has to be preserved?
Thank you, Soraya, for that. I will avoid, as a Roman Catholic, responding to the idea of deconstructing received theology. I would love to hear more about that, but let me answer your two questions. I think it is terribly important what you said for the American Muslim community to reach out to President Trump. I know that there is a great deal of anger and fear. I teach at Georgetown. I have many Muslim students in my class, and the day after the election, there was a great deal of expression of this fear, and I do not underestimate it or denigrate it in the slightest. I mean, people do not manufacture fear. I guess some do for political reasons, but that's not what's going on here. There is fear. And I think the administration would do well to acknowledge that, even if they think it's illegitimate. I mean, to acknowledge that people are concerned and afraid is very important. But I think the premise of your question is that, if I might, that this is a country that really does, with whatever president, including this one, believe in the equality of all of its citizens. Certainly the genius, in my view, of our American system has been its First Amendment and its guarantee of the free exercise of religion for everybody, for all of its individual citizens and all of its religious communities. And this is why I think there is an obligation, not only a right, but an obligation of all American religious communities, especially now the Muslim community, to reach out to President Trump and say, look, we are citizens of this country. We have a right and an obligation to let you know our views. So, there was a story in the newspaper of a colleague of mine, a man I deeply admire, Imam Muhammad Majid, who is with the Adams Center here in Northern Virginia, who attended an event during the inauguration, or maybe it was a prayer event at the National Cathedral, and was just attacked by not only by many on the American left, secular left, as you will, but by some Muslims as well, for sort of doing what he does. I mean, this is a man who reaches out to both sides. I think he is a perfect example of what you're talking about. Now, on the right, the Trump supporters, Majid is he's a this and a that. Well, look, we've got to stop this. We have to talk to each other. And so what you said in your first question is so important, and I just urge you, I exhort you, and your Muslim women have a very important role here. And I just think it's vital what you're doing, so please continue. Now, on the idea of extremist ideology, I mean, when I talk about religious freedom being a counterterrorism tool, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, I mean, there are many ways to say this, but let me just pick one. If we can advance religious freedom effectively in Muslim-majority countries where this vicious ideology is, if not dominant, at least flourishing. And Iraq is a perfect example of it. Let's just say, hypothetically, that God willing, please God, there will be a post-ISIS Iraq in which there is an opportunity, once again, to try to put that society back together and give the lesson that if you can see your way through to true religious freedom for all of the disparate Muslims within that society, for the Christians, the Yazidis, the Turkmen, and everybody else who is an Iraqi citizen who lives in that country, full equality under the law and in culture, what this will do for you is extraordinary. But the most important point here is that it will undermine a future ISIS or Al-Qaeda or a violent Islamist extremist movement, which will rise again if this ideology is not expelled from Islam. And so right now, Muslims in many of these countries lack the capacity to do this because they lack religious freedom. So I hope that gets to, very briefly, it's broad brush, but that there is a vital need to advance religious freedom in order to undermine religion-related violence and terrorism. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Our next question comes from Robert Osborne with the Wilberforce Academy. Robert, you may go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you so very much. I work in the higher education arena, specifically at the University of Minnesota as a campus minister, and have also taught courses at the university. I have two questions, but they're all related. One is it possible that people in your network could initiate conversations with Betsy DeVos, the new Secretary of Education, or at least the one that's elect, I believe, and discuss the possibility of providing grants to higher education institutions, or at least to faculty who are willing to initiate coursework in religious liberty. It seems to me that one of our problems with our State Department employees is that they simply do not get any coursework in this regard, and they know nothing about religious liberty. My second related question is have we considered the important role of international students in the United States as potential advocates for religious liberty when they go home? Many of them come as we regard them as future leaders. We have evidence that that's the case, and often. Could they be brought to and put into seminars on religious liberty, or invited to participate in such seminars as a way to begin a momentum in their thinking while they're here studying here in the United States? Okay, I'll wait for your response. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Robert. Those are two great questions. And I have to tell you, I do things like this from time to time, and I don't think I've ever had a better recommendation than your Betsy DeVos recommendation. I think she was confirmed today as Secretary of Education, to those who don't know. Is it possible to think of grants to higher education institutions for coursework in religious liberty? I think it's a terrific idea, and I'm going to try to figure out how to, get, as you say, people in my circle who might be in a position to move that. But what I would like, so the answer is yes, I'm going to take that on. Let me, however, use your question to eliminate the premise or the correct assumption. That is to say that American students are not being exposed to what once used to be called the first freedom of America. That I teach at Georgetown, as I said. I teach juniors and seniors and graduate students, and occasionally sophomores and freshmen. These are bright kids. It's wonderful to teach them. It's a privilege to teach them. Often, I find that even though they will have taken American history or histories of the states in which they, were born and raised and went to school, high school, and so forth. They did not. They were not exposed to the notion of religious freedom as I think our founders understood it, and that is not only as a fundamental human right, but as a limit on government, which was very important to the American founders. In other words, not only just the checks and balances, the division of the powers, the separation of powers, but the First Amendment, the free exercise clause of the First Amendment is designed to empower religious communities to do good works within American society. I mean, they didn't quite put it that way, but this is what they had in mind. And that's why in the United States today you have this huge, huge faith-based civil society. If you took out all the faith-based civil society organizations, the hospitals, Seventh-day Adventists, the Catholic and Protestant and Muslim schools, there's a Muslim college, Zaytuna College in California, soup kitchens, immigration, you can go on and on. If you took all of that out of American society, our civil society would be far weaker than it was. So the point is, it does good works. It also limits government, because otherwise government would provide those services. So the people aren't trained about this. Our kids don't understand it this way. They are being taught to think of religious freedom as just this claim by religious people for exemptions from otherwise, laws. And I hear you want to follow up, and I'll stop. Let me just make this point. I think on your second question, it's the same thing. If you're just parachuted down into American society today, and your course on religious freedom is to read the newspapers, the New York Times, or for that matter, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, which just issued a terrible, hateful report, in my opinion, in which it said religious freedom is a front for bigotry, Christian supremacy, sexism, and other hateful things. It's just not true. And so we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do in our own country, because this is not some claim by a clique within our society. It is what makes our society what it is. It's part of the greatness of our country. So I heard you wanted to follow up, Robert.
Yes, just to simply say we're thinking on exactly the same lines, and I'll be glad to follow up with you privately offline because I know exactly where we need to go. Thanks so much.
I invite that. I mean, I would just add on your second question, we have many excellent programs, and here let me give the State Department some kudos. It has for many years had international travelers programs, students and others. I think students are the most important because, any kind of change you want has got to begin with the young. But, even geezers like me can learn, and we have lots of people who come to our country and are supposedly exposed to religious freedom by being taken around. And sometimes I worry that they're not really being exposed, to the advantages that can be there in religious freedom, but to some of the fierce, terrible arguments that we're having that leave them with, they're entitled to be confused about what is this first freedom so-called that the United States has. If we can't fix that problem ourselves, we're going to have a lot of trouble fixing it overseas.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay. Our next question comes from caller. I didn't quite get your name at the beginning of the call, so I'm going to unmute your line. And when you hear that your line has been unmuted, go ahead with your question. Okay. Well, maybe they're not there. Okay. I'm going to go to now John Kenyon with IGCS. John, go ahead with your question.
20 questions packed into one, if I could. Current U.S. foreign policy towards, say, Putin and Russia, do they bring in any calculation with respect to things like Putin's relationship to the Russian Orthodox Church and the recent calamity between the Pope and the Russian Orthodox Church, or the fact that Poland just declared Christ as Lord? I mean, even as an objective factor in how they form the foreign policy?
Well, that's another great question. I mean, the short answer is that in my opinion, of course, I'm not an insider in the administration, this one or any other, but my observation is that no, there is virtually no consideration, but there must be, and this is, by the way, one of the roles of an ambassador at large who knows what he or she is doing, is to intrude this into the discussions. This is why the ambassador at large needs the authority to sit in on major policy discussions. I didn't really emphasize this as I went through it, but I mentioned it. Today, the ambassador at large is just seen as a sort of a mid-level official in the State Department. This guy needs to sit in on the discussions about Russia or any other country where religion is a major important issue and say, look, we've got the Russian Orthodox Church. We've got Putin saying this, that, and the other thing. We've got the Pope. We've got a number we've got the Salvation Army and other religious minorities in Russia. We have a whole history in the 1990s of Russia developing its own religious freedom law after the fall of the Soviet Union and then retrenching on it. And there's a lot of work we could be doing there, but we haven't been doing it. And so this is a very good example of where this is not simple. None of this is simple. And it's not a straight line from here to there. But among the things that we need, in my opinion, to be doing with respect to our foreign policy in Russia is to be taking advantage of I kind of mentioned it in an American context in the last question, the growth of religious freedom in Russia can provide a greater incentive to some other good things, including limitations on the government. I, by the way, am of the opinion that Vladimir Putin is a thug and an authoritarian. He may have accepted Christ as his Lord and Savior. Forgive me if I see this as a somewhat cynical move. Maybe he means it. But as a ruler, he is an authoritarian who threatens the vital interests of NATO and the United States. Now, what has that got to do with religious freedom? I believe there is a connection, and I believe that the Russian Orthodox Church has an important role to play. But we don't talk to the Russian Orthodox Church about this. We have had, I think, very little exposure on our part to not only what they think and what their role is in internal Russian political life and let alone religious life, but what we might be communicating with the Russian Orthodox Church concerning their own role in Russian civil society. I think this is a very important subject, and you could spend an entire administration working on this. We haven't. I hope we will.
Yeah, one comment just as well with respect to their foreign policy. What I've been reading is that the Chaldean Church in Syria appealed to the Russian Orthodox Church to get Putin to invade, and then maybe the reason for his pause in invading eastern Ukraine had something to do with the fact that in western Ukraine, they're kind of loyal to the Pope and predominantly Catholic. Yet the ties with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, with the Russian Orthodox Church, they just all seem to me to be far more important with respect to just understanding the foreign policy than just the pure secular nationalistic outlook on things.
Right. I think that's right, and I think there's something at work here even broader than the relationships between these religious groups. And if I might just briefly say that one of our projects at the Religious Freedom Institute, which I head, is a project called Under Caesar's Sword, Christian Responses to Persecution, and we're having a big event in April, which people can find on our website if you're interested, religiousfreedom.org. The point is, Christians, and this is human nature, it's not about Christians, minorities that have been brutalized over the centuries, let alone the last 10 years. It is not surprising that they turn to authoritarians to help them. The United States, in my opinion, has done very little to help the besieged minorities in Syria, Christians or otherwise, Iraq or elsewhere in the region, and notwithstanding the enormous national security stakes that are there. It isn't just humanitarian. It is that. Human beings are suffering. People are being raped, tortured, killed, unjustly imprisoned. We've done very little to help them, and it's not just about refugee policy, but it's in our interest to do so. It is not surprising to me that the Christians of Iraq, in a sense, felt in retrospect they were doing a heck of a lot better under Saddam than they are now. It is no surprise that Christians today in Syria can turn to Assad and to Putin as a savior. It is something that we have not sufficiently thought about, and my view is we haven't thought about it enough because we don't see it as a national security issue. We wipe our hands of this too much. We see it as purely a humanitarian issue. And this is why I emphasize so much the importance of religious freedom as a national security issue, because it is a truth, but you hear it too often. We can't save everybody in the world. It's true. I mean, there's 60 million refugees in the world, and we can't take them all in. Or there are people being brutalized across the world every second, every moment. We can't save them all. All true. But these people and the fate of these people are going to impact your children, my children, grandchildren. We ought to have an interest in it for that reason as well as helping and standing with others.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Tom?
Megan, do we have another question in the queue?
Not at this time.
Okay. In the meantime, I have a question myself. I'll take moderator's prerogative here. And I'm thinking about this issue in multilateral engagements during the next administration. A couple of the lines that stood out from the president's inaugural address had certainly a tone more of we'll go America first, that America will look after its own interests first, and it will not seek to impose its views on any other nation. So I'm wondering if in that context, how could we best encourage the next administration to nevertheless be as multilateral as possible in its approach to promoting international religious freedom?
Well, great question, Dennis. Thanks for that. Somebody ought to write a book about this. Oh, that's right. You and I are doing that.
That's right.
Here's my view on this. We are living in a time that whereas our Western democratic colleagues, our allies in NATO and elsewhere, are beginning to recognize some of the truth of what we've been talking about today, and that is that religious freedom is not just a nice-to-have boutique human rights issue, but it is also an issue that has an impact. And, of course, given the immigration crisis that over the last year or so they have suffered in Europe, that has had an impact. I think you and I were together at a conference in London, sponsored by the London Foreign Office, in which they were looking at this very issue, excuse me, on how to think about this from a British point of view. So the point is that our other allies and friends are beginning to ask the question, how can we do this better? Because we're all interested in trying to save, reduce persecution, and stop human rights violations, religious or otherwise. I mean, most democracies have integrated those things into their foreign policies, but religion has always been sort of the ugly stepsister for many reasons. Some of it is just rampant secularism in Europe and in Canada and other places, although Canada does not have now, an Office of International Religious Freedom with its own ambassador for religious freedom, a guy named Andrew Bennett, under the previous government. That office has now unfortunately gone away, but it's an example of the, if not yet systematic, then at least episodic interest among Western democracies in the very issue that we are talking about. We would be foolish not to lead that. I mean, I see this as a group, and including the first caller who asked about the United Nations, I see this as an opportunity for the United States to do what it says it does in the world, and that is lead, not by telling people what to do, not by forcing our views on anybody else, but by saying, hey, look, we have a common interest in something here. You voiced it, we voiced it. We may go about it in different ways, but let's get together, and there are any number of ways this could be done. One is something that is already being developed and hopefully will continue, a legislators groups that are interested in religious freedom. So we see parliamentarians from Belgium and elsewhere in the northern part of Europe and Italy and the United Kingdom and Germany getting together and meeting periodically about issues of religious persecution. But we also see the executive branches and the foreign offices of these governments beginning to at least ask themselves, as the Canadians did, should we have a high-level official devoted to this issue? It seemed to be very hard for them to come to this conclusion, but they're all inching in that direction. So this isn't a case, Dennis, where we tell others how to do it. It is a case where we can say, look, we've had lots of experience in this, and it hasn't all been good. I began our conversation by saying, I don't think we've done a very good job of this. And of course, American history is replete with very difficult problems of religious freedom, even though we consider it our first freedom. We persecuted our own. So there's a good conversation to be had here. And leadership is not about telling other people what to do, especially on the issue of religion. It simply won't work. I've never yet found a conversation that begins, come, let us reason about what's wrong with you, as a very good way to lead. It doesn't work. So we can do this. We need to do it. It's in our interest. Others believe that, and we should. Multilateral initiatives to advance religious freedom and reduce persecution around the world.
Well, great. I couldn't agree more, and that will make its way into our book, I'm sure. Our time, unfortunately, is now up, so I will reluctantly have to close out the call. But thank you again, Tom, for level of expertise and keen insight on U.S. international religious policy, where it's been and where it can and should go from here. Thank you also to all our callers for joining us today. You can listen again and share the audio from this call and explore the full archive of our past calls at the media library of the IGE website, www.globalengage.org. Finally, if you like the Faith and International Affairs conference call series and would like to help keep it going strong, please also visit the support page at the IGE website and consider making a tax-deductible donation. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.